Your signature is right there on the collateral agreement, Dad. You approved all of it." That is how my son told me he had mortgaged Eleanor's cabin. Not with an apology, not with the decency to look me in the eye, but with a spreadsheet slid across his kitchen island and a shrug that told me he had rehearsed this moment more than once. I sat there staring at the document. The paper had my name on it. The signature looked like mine. The notary stamp was dated 14 months ago, 2 weeks after my bypass surgery, when I was still on blood thinners and couldn't always remember what day of the week it was. The cabin in Whitefish, Montana, had been my wife's. Eleanor inherited it from her father, a stubborn old Swede who'd built it one board at a time in the early 1970s. When Eleanor passed 3 years ago from a cancer that moved faster than any of us were prepared for, the estate attorney was very clear about the terms. The property transferred to me in a revocable living trust, for my use and benefit for the remainder of my life. 12 acres of ponderosa pine overlooking Whitefish Lake. On today's market, worth approximately $420,000. My son, he is 41, a man who has always operated as though the world owed him a shorter path to wherever he was heading, had used that cabin as collateral for a $2 million small business loan. The loan funded the launch of his restaurant group. He called it the Copper Ember. "I don't remember signing this," I said. My voice was level in that careful way I had learned since Eleanor died, when I started measuring every word because there was no one left to talk me back from the edge of things. He leaned against the counter. His wife stood slightly behind him, arms folded, wearing that particular expression of hers, the one that somehow managed to look sympathetic and superior at the same time. "Dad," he said, in the tone you use with someone whose judgment you no longer trust, "you were there. You asked questions. We went through all of it. You signed." I was 2 weeks out of open-heart surgery. "The doctor cleared you," his wife said. "You were perfectly competent." What I kept folded behind my teeth, while the room seemed to tilt slightly under me, was that I had received a letter 3 days earlier from a bank in Billings I had never heard of, informing me that the trust property at 4417 Lakeview Ridge Road, Whitefish, empty, was 90 days past due on its loan obligation and subject to foreclosure proceedings. I had not known there was a loan. I had not known there was any obligation whatsoever. I was 63 years old, a retired civils engineer, a man who had spent 35 years checking load-bearing calculations before he put his name on anything. I did not sign away my dead wife's cabin while recovering from open-heart surgery. I was absolutely certain of that, and I was terrified that no one would believe me. The drive back to Spokane took 4 hours. I watched the highway and ran the arithmetic of my situation. My son had either forged the document or maneuvered me into signing it under circumstances I couldn't clearly recall, which, legally speaking, might amount to the same thing. His restaurant group had borrowed $2 million against collateral I hadn't knowingly provided, and when I'd raised my voice at his kitchen island, his wife had said quietly, with great and deliberate care, "We've been worried about you, you know, since the surgery." The memory lapses. Memory lapses, 2 words, the knife they were already sharpening. By Thursday of the following week, my daughter-in-law had made a series of phone calls. My brother, a man whose judgment I had trusted for 6 decades, called to say, gently and haltingly, that my son was concerned, that the family was concerned, that perhaps I should consider talking to someone. "He says you've been getting confused," my brother told me, "forgetting things you agreed to." "I didn't agree to mortgage Eleanor's cabin," I said. "He has your signature, though." There was a long silence on the line, and in it I could hear the shape of what was being built around me. A story, laid one worried phone call at a time, that would eventually make me the problem. The confused widower, the difficult old man, the father who couldn't accept that he'd made a decision and now regretted it. I thought about that on the drive home. I thought about Eleanor and what she would have done in my place. She was the kind of woman who kept records of everything, who photographed receipts, who had a manila file folder for every contractor who'd ever set foot in that cabin, organized by year and trade, going back to 1987. I went home and started going through her files. It took me 3 weeks of evenings and 2 calls to the county recorder's office in Flathead County to understand the full geometry of what had been done to me. The notary on the collateral agreement worked at a document preparation business owned by my daughter-in-law's cousin. The LLC that held the mortgage was called Ember Holdings, registered in Delaware, with my son listed as managing partner. But inside the operating agreement, which I obtained through a public records request, there was a second name on the passive investor line. Mine, my full legal name, my social security number, listed as a 30% silent partner in Ember Holdings LLC. I am trained as a CPA, though I spent my career in engineering. I understand what that designation means on a tax filing. It means liability. It means that when Copper Ember failed, and looking at the quarterly cash flow projections embedded in the loan documents, it was already failing. I would be on the hook for a portion of the debt. Not just the cabin. The debt. My son had not simply borrowed against my property. He had enrolled me in his failure without my knowledge, and arranged things so that I would absorb the consequences when everything fell apart. He had used my name, my credit history, my clean professional record, and my dead wife's land to build himself a floor to fall onto. I sat at Eleanor's writing desk for a long time after I understood that. The brass pharmacy lamp threw its yellow circle of light across the papers. Outside, November rain worked at the windows. The silence of the house was complete. I thought about calling an attorney, and I thought about calling my son, and I thought about the fact that Eleanor had been gone for 3 years, and this was the family we had become without her. I called the attorney. She specialized in elder financial abuse, and she had heard versions of this story before, which was both a comfort and a horror. She told me the signature issue was real, that the circumstances of the signing potentially actionable, but that coerced or forged signatures in trust documents were notoriously slow to unwind. You need independent corroboration, she said. Someone who was present or documentation that establishes your mental state at the time. Medical records alone rarely decide these cases. I hadn't been with anyone at the signing. I had no witnesses. The following Saturday, I drove to Whitefish. I needed to stand in the cabin. I'm not entirely sure what I was looking for. Maybe nothing more than Eleanor's presence, and a clear head to decide whether this fight was worth the years it would take. The key still worked. The room smelled of pine resin and dust, and, faintly, of the lavender sachets she kept in every closet. I walked slowly through the place, running my hand along the bookshelves, looking at her grandfather's fishing rods above the stone fireplace. In the back bedroom she used as a study, I sat down at her desk. The drawers held the ordinary residue of her life. Stamps, a dried-up pen, reading glasses she'd been looking for since 2019, a box of letters. At the very back of the bottom drawer, wrapped in a cloth that had once been a kitchen towel, was her old laptop. She called it her writing computer. She kept her journal on it and didn't want the internet getting in the way. I don't know entirely why I opened it. Some impulse, half grief and half habit, to sit in her thinking. The battery was dead. I found the charger in the desk, plugged it in, waited, and eventually the machine came to life. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was simply staying in the room with her for a while. I found the folder nearly by accident. It was labeled Trust Documents, and it contained scanned copies of the deed, the original trust paperwork, notes she'd made about property taxes over the years, and one video file named with a date that I recognized immediately. The date of the closing meeting with the estate attorney, the afternoon the trust was finalized. Eleanor had recorded the meeting. Of course she had. She recorded every important conversation she'd ever had, a habit that had made me quietly crazy for 30 years, and that I had quietly loved about her. The video was 44 minutes long. Most of it was the estate attorney, a careful, deliberate woman in her 60s, walking Eleanor through each provision of the trust in the methodical way that good estate attorneys do. At 12 minutes in, Eleanor asked her to be specific about one thing. I heard Eleanor's voice from behind the camera, steady and precise. I want it stated clearly for the record. This cabin is for my husband, not for either of our children, not for any corporation or trust successor, for my husband, for his use and enjoyment, for as long as he lives. Can you confirm that on camera? The attorney confirmed it. She laid out the express language of the trust, including the provision requiring the written consent of two independent co-trustees, both of whom were required to certify the trustor's sound mental state before the property could be pledged as collateral for any debt. No such consent had been obtained, because no one had bothered to ask, because no one was supposed to be pledging this property for anything. I watched the video 3 times, sitting in Eleanor's chair while the light outside went gray and then dark. Then I called my attorney and told her to check her email. I heard the change in her voice while she watched it. She told me to send the file immediately and not to mention its existence to anyone. I followed that instruction for exactly 8 days. Because on the 9th day, I received a letter from a geriatric psychiatrist whose office was in my son's neighborhood. The letter stated that based on reports from family members and what it called collateral behavioral history, this physician had significant concerns about my cognitive fitness and was recommending a formal competency evaluation. If I refused to comply voluntarily, he intended to file a report with Adult Protective Services, suggesting I might be at risk of financial self-harm. The letter was dated 2 days after I had called my attorney. Someone had told my son I was moving, or he had known me well enough to assume it, and he had moved first. I will be honest with you, I sat in my truck in my own driveway for a long while after reading that letter. I am 63 years old, not 83. I run 3 miles every morning, I do the crossword in pen, I still do my own taxes by hand because I don't fully trust the software. But the law doesn't adjudicate capability, it adjudicates process. And my son had enough money and enough of his mother's intelligence, the part she hadn't intended to give him, to understand that process can be turned into a weapon. He had put me in a position where fighting him would look like the behavior of a combative, deteriorating old man who couldn't accept that he'd made a bad decision. I called my attorney and read her the letter aloud. She was quiet for a moment. He escalated, she said, which means he's frightened. She told me what she was going to do and in what sequence, and she was clear about one thing. Don't contact my son. Don't explain myself to the family. Don't tip my hand to anyone. I did not call my son. I did, however, make one phone call I had made 3 months earlier, before any of this had reached the surface. A man I'd worked alongside on 2 federal infrastructure audits in the 1990s had recently retired from the IRS and gone into private consulting. I had called him the same week I found my name on the Ember Holdings operating agreement, before I'd told anyone else a single thing. I had passed him copies of the documents. He had, in his quiet and professional way, passed them to the appropriate division. The 6 weeks that followed were the longest of my life. My attorney retained a forensic document examiner who produced a 12-page report on the collateral agreement signature. The conclusion was careful, the way these things always are, but clear. The signature showed characteristics inconsistent with other verified samples from the same period. The notary, when deposed, could not recall the meeting and could not confirm that standard protocols for establishing mental capacity had been observed. The estate attorney who appeared in Eleanor's video submitted a detailed affidavit. She was still in practice, and she was furious. The competency petition was formally filed by my son's legal team in late January. My attorney responded within the week. Her response included, among other things, a documented account of how the petition had originated, the relationship between the signing physician and my daughter-in-law, and a request that the licensing board reviews the circumstances under which the letter had been written. The petition was withdrawn shortly after. My son's grand opening for his 5th Copper Ember location was held on a Friday evening in February at the original restaurant in downtown Spokane. It was a full room. Investors, local press, a city council member who'd given a quote to the business section about economic revitalization. My son stood near the bar in a charcoal suit, working the room with the ease that I recognized from when he was young, when he could make any adult in any room believe he was the most promising person in it. I walked in through the front door. He saw me from 40 feet away, and the ease left his face completely. He covered the distance between us quickly and quietly, smiling in a way that was meant for the people around us and not for me. "Dad," he said, very low, "you don't want to do this. You are going to embarrass yourself in front of people who matter to this city." "I'm not here to embarrass myself," I said, at a volume 3 nearby tables could hear clearly. "I'm here because my name is on the operating agreement for this business, as a passive investor, which makes what happens in this room partly my concern." The room had quieted around us in that way rooms do when something real begins to happen. His wife materialized at his elbow. "Let's go outside," she said. "No," I said. "I think the people in this room should know what I found on Eleanor's laptop." My son's expression shifted into something I hadn't seen on his face since he was a teenager, and had been caught in a lie that was too large to talk his way out of. He leaned slightly toward me. "If you say one more word, I will have you removed. I have a signed physician's assessment. I will stand in this room and tell everyone here that my father is experiencing cognitive decline and that I am heartbroken about it, and they will believe me because I have been telling them for 3 months." "I know what you've been telling people," I said. "I also know that the physician who signed that assessment has never examined me, has never met me, and was referred to your wife through a personal connection that is now part of a licensing board inquiry." His wife's hand dropped from his arm. I had made arrangements the previous afternoon with an AV technician through a contact my attorney's office used. The presentation screen behind the bar had been cycling through photographs of the other Copper Ember locations. It stopped doing that. Eleanor's face appeared on the screen, filling it from edge to edge. Her voice, clear and unhurried, came through the speakers that had been playing soft background music a moment before. "I want it stated clearly for the record," Eleanor said. "This cabin is for my husband." The room was absolutely still. The estate attorney's voice followed, laying out every provision with the patience and precision of a woman who had drawn up thousands of documents in her career and understood why words had to mean exactly what they said. My son turned to look at the screen, and I watched him understand, in the span of a few seconds, that the thing he had built was already over. "That recording was private property," he said. His voice had gone flat. "You had no legal right." "Eleanor recorded it herself, on her own computer, in her own folder," I said. "It has been submitted to the court, to the Flathead County Recorder, and to the IRS, along with the Ember Holdings operating agreement and 6/4 of tax filings that list me as a passive partner in a business I never agreed to enter." The front doors opened. 2 men came in wearing jackets that identified them clearly enough. One of them addressed my son by his full legal name and asked him to come outside. My daughter-in-law began to say something. I'm not sure what it was, because the room had filled with a low and stunned murmuring that swallowed whatever she'd started. She looked at me, and her face moved through expressions I had never seen on it in 13 years of holidays and Sunday dinners. I had known her since before they were married. She had sat with Eleanor at the hospital during the last weeks. She had cried at the funeral, and I had believed the tears. "I'm sorry it came to this," I told her. I meant it. I was 63 years old, and I had just watched my son be escorted out of his own restaurant by investigators, and I was genuinely, painfully sorry that this was what we had become. But I was not going to apologize for Eleanor's voice on that screen. I was not going to apologize for the truth. The legal proceedings took most of the following year. They are tedious in the way that legal proceedings tend to be. Methodical, repetitive, expensive, occasionally absurd. The cabin was released from collateral within 4 months. The title returned to the trust unencumbered. The Ember Holdings LLC was dissolved by court order. The $2 million loan was restructured and partially absorbed by the lender, who had its own legal exposure to contend with. My son and his wife entered plea agreements in October, wire fraud and conspiracy. 3 years each at a minimum security facility in eastern Washington. The Copper Ember locations, all 5 of them, closed by spring. I read about it in the business section, which I still take with my morning coffee. The geriatrics psychiatrist reached a voluntary resolution with the state licensing board. I harbor no particular anger toward him. He signed a letter he shouldn't have signed on behalf of people he shouldn't have trusted. He will live with that. My brother called the week after everything became public. He didn't say much, and neither did I. He said he was sorry he'd doubted me. I told him he'd heard a story that was designed to be believed, and he'd responded the way most people would. I don't hold that against him. I've spent a lot of time over the past year thinking about how skillfully this thing was constructed, how every element was calibrated to make me look like the problem. And there's a kind of grudging acknowledgement, I feel, underneath the grief, for the sheer amount of careful thought that went into undoing me. My son inherited his mother's mind and used it in ways she never would have permitted herself. I drove up to Whitefish in April, when the snow had cleared enough to make the road reasonable. I opened the cabin, let the cold air out, built a fire in the stone fireplace. The brass lamp still worked. Eleanor's books were on the shelves in the order she left them. Her grandfather's fishing rods still hung above the mantel. I sat on the porch that first evening with a cup of coffee, watching the lake go purple and then black under a sky that still held a thin band of orange at the horizon. A family of geese was working its way along the far shore, unhurried and utterly indifferent to everything. The pines stood the way they always stand, enormous and still and enduring, like they've heard this kind of story before and are waiting patiently for it to be over. Eleanor had called this place a gift from her father. I have spent 3 years coming to understand that a gift is not only a thing, it is an intention, an act of faith between the person who gives and the person who receives. Her father built this cabin for people who understood what it cost to be still. Eleanor understood. She had married a man who worked in concrete and load-bearing steel for 35 years, who knew the difference between what holds and what only looks like it holds. Who would be sitting on this porch in April when the geese came back? She had also, it turns out, understood her son well enough to set up a camera at an attorney's conference table one Tuesday afternoon and make sure that what was true had somewhere to live long after she was gone. I raised my coffee cup toward the lake. It was a small gesture, private, the kind you make when no one is watching and gratitude has to go somewhere. Then I went inside to call my attorney about the property tax reassessment, because the work of being alive is mostly paperwork, and Eleanor would have wanted me to keep the records straight.